Joining me now from Baltimore is Councilman Brandon Scott. Here in Cleveland, the Reverend Rev.Colvin, and in Chicago, Cook County Commissioner Richard Boynton. Thank you all for being here.
Thanks for having us.
Reverend Colvin, you've done a lot of work to combat gun violence here in Cleveland. What do community leaders need to do? I know your work here. I know the 300 men that the councilman talks about in Baltimore. A lot of community groups not getting the attention. What works, and what do community leaders need to do?
Well, the first thing, Rev, I think that we need to begin to look at violence in a very broad sense. We talk about the violence that's taking place in our streets, but we also need to begin to understand about the violence that people deal with systematically each and every day. So much of what we see in our community in terms of the crime and the depravity and some of the hostilities that we see are really born out of hopelessness and fear that people will not be able to rise out of their circumstances. When we talk about violence, but we've got to talk about the violence of the defunding of public education. We've got to talk about the violence of the corporate robbing of people of their mortgages that left communities like Sandtown and neighboring communities here in Cleveland really deprived and stole millions of dollars of wealth out of our cities and our urban core, which were already needed. And in the midst of that, while we fight for individual institutional justice, when we think about individual justice for those families that are struggling with losses due to violence that they experience every day, the personal tragedies. And so for all of us, whether we're serving in city councils, whether we're serving in churches, we've got to begin to look at violence in a very total and comprehensive way, because when we do that, we realize that there are root causes to some of the individual acts that we see, and many of them are institutional.
You know, Reverend Colvin, the commissioner said we must show the same outrage when we question policing as we do when there's gunshots and killings of blacks on blacks. You do that, I do that with my organization. In fact, just this week in Cleveland, the Justice Department agreed to reforms to the police department. You're having a big rally. I'm speaking for you tonight at your church. When you look at these reforms, how are these steps, and what do you think these steps could do to help drive down crime as well as holding police accountable?
Well, Rev, you're absolutely right. It is a step. We know that policing is the first doorstep into the entire criminal justice system. What's important to this consent decree, and I have not had the opportunity to read it in its entirety, but I have an overview of it, is its aim to bridge the relationship between the police and the community. We have seen in so many cities that those relationships between law enforcement and the community has been severed. And as a result of that, many neighbors and many members of the community don't feel comfortable with sharing with law enforcement and participating in the crime-solving endeavor. And as a result of that, there is this gap, there is this chasm, there is this distance between law enforcement and those whom they are oath to serve. And as a result of that, we see cases in which crimes are going unsolved because people have a fear of working with law enforcement because of their own experiences, because of what they've seen with respect to their family, anecdotal stories that we hear in our barbershops, our beauty shops. And so critical to any reform is not only going to be, as you pointed out, policies and procedures that limit the excessive use of force, but it's going to be making sure that the new policing that we see in our community bridges the gap, because we have got to change the culture within our force so we can change the culture in the relationship between law enforcement and the community. And when we address that, which is decades long, it did not begin with Cleveland, it did not begin in Ferguson, did not begin in Baltimore. This is a decades-long challenge between the relationship between law enforcement and the urban core, particularly the African-American community. And so critical is going to be community policing. It's going to be coming out of the squad cars. It's going to be sitting down with neighborhood residents, viewing them as members of a community and a civil society, and working together and rebuilding a trust that has been broken. And as a result of that, we now see increases in violence and increases in unsolved crimes as we're seeing this crime wave going throughout many of our urban neighborhoods and cities.
And we must start, though, with building trust and accountability on all sides. This is a huge discussion. We will continue to have it here as we have in the past, and we must go forward and build that trust and we must change the culture on all sides of this. Councilman Scott and Commissioner Boykin, Rev.Colvin, see you in about an hour. Thank you all for being on time and in this discussion tonight.
Thank you.